Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second PSW Leadership Webinar Series. My name is Amanda Lyon, and I will be one of your co-facilitators for the next 15 to 20 minutes. So I am a graduate of the University of Washington out in Seattle and currently a first-year administrative resident at the University of Wisconsin. I'm happy to be able to have the opportunity to interview Sarah today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chad Caldwell. I'm a graduate from Roseman University in Henderson, Nevada, and a current PGY2 in Health System Pharmacy Administration resident at the Madison VA. Looking forward to a great webinar today. So our guest speaker today is Dr. Sarah Pagenkopf, Director of Pharmacy for Fort Healthcare, and also the PGY1 Residency Program Director for Fort Healthcare. Dr. Pagenkopf's professional bio is listed here for your review. So today we have 3 learning objectives. The first is to define the 5 key components of emotional intelligence. The second is to identify effective strategies to improve specific components of emotional intelligence. And finally, we'll discuss why a high level of emotional intelligence is necessary for an effective leader. So Sarah, to start things off, I'd just like to kind of ask you, what does emotional intelligence mean to you?
Well, Chad and Amanda, thank you both for asking me to talk on a topic. I think that to share a little bit more about what emotional intelligence means to me, we have to kind of look back and see what emotional intelligence really means. So this isn't a new idea. Emotional intelligence was discussed by an individual in the 1920s named Edward Thorndike, and he called it social intelligence. Several other individuals discussed that more, that special part of intelligence and personality that was really non-intelligence, which was more cognitive abilities or ability to communicate. And 2 college professors in the 1990s, John Mayer and Peter Salvoni, discussed it at length, and in their respective colleges even have emotional intelligence schools. So I think more and more we've looked at a best-selling book that came out by Daniel Coleman, which has helped us to focus a little bit more on emotional intelligence. And I guess to look at what emotional intelligence is, you have to parse out what cognitive intelligence is. And that's really, your motor coordination, your memory, your vocabulary skills, math, and higher functioning reasoning. And then what's left is really your emotional intelligence. So it's been defined as listening to, understanding people's concerns, fostering a meaningful dialogue, building trust, establishing personal relationships. And I would say for me, emotional intelligence is something that I have to actively work on in most all of my day-to-day work. But really, it's looking internally to see how I feel about a interaction or a dialogue that happened. And it's really doing a bit of self-assessment. So it's something we ask our residents to do throughout their residency training. It's really assessing yourself very quickly to remove any negative self-talk, focus on that positive self-talk, consider others' feelings, their motivations. Why are they bringing that concern to you? To continue to build trust and to give a verbal response that builds trust and keeps communication open. So that's a little bit of crucial conversations if anybody's done that training, to make sure that people feel safe to give you a response. And you have to do all of that very quickly before you give a response. So emotional intelligence, I guess, to me, is an inward reflection before you speak, before you act, but then also post-discussion to reflect back and say, how could I have handled that differently, or did I handle that well? So I think that that's really what emotional intelligence means to me. It's all the nonverbals and part of the verbals that happen when we're engaging in conversation or conflict resolution, or even day-to-day interactions with our colleagues and our team.
Excellent. So it seems from what I'm hearing is that a huge component of that is kind of the self-assessment portion and reflecting and gaining experiences kind of from all the day-to-day interactions that you have, and kind of growing
Absolutely. And I think that emotional intelligence, and, I think a lot of the writers have looked at this, your emotional intelligence can be different depending on what hat you're wearing, right? So you may be very emotionally intelligent in your personal relationships or your home relationships or your relationship with your spouse or your children, but have a different response when you come to work. So it's being able to look across that spectrum and say, why am I a different person in my home than when I am at work? But being able to be able to identify negative behaviors and respond before they become problematic.
All right. And then just kind of diving into, since what it means to you, would you be able to kind of discuss briefly the kind of 5 major components that people kind of discuss in regards to emotional intelligence, and which of those do you feel is the most important for healthcare providers to work on?
Yeah. So Daniel Coleman, I think, set those 5 main components that most people think of, which are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. But I'm going to actually focus on a different set of authors that I think looked at this a little bit differently. So I will make the transition back to those 5 main components, but I'm going to augment them a little bit. So authors Stephen Stein and Howard Book wrote a really great book, which I can provide you the reference to, called The EQ Edge, which is an emotional intelligence kind of guideline, a success book to track yourself a little bit. And they summarize those 5 components just slightly differently. So they still agree with self-awareness, which self-awareness is really, how are you feeling and why do you feel that way? And then how are your emotions impacting others? So that's you being positive or you being negative, and what does that mean to those around you? But then also being able to recognize your strengths or weaknesses and trying to improve them. So that's really the self-awareness component. Self-regulation is the next component that is discussed, but these authors discussed it more as self-expression. So they looked at it as the way that you face the world. So expressing your feelings and your words non-verbally, your ability to be assertive, and to independently control yourself. So that's potentially, I think, for most people, they think of it in a negative way of, maybe losing your temper. So acting before you lose your temper. But I might think of it a different way, is that if you are someone who doesn't necessarily lose your temper, I mean, maybe you crawl inside yourself and you don't speak. That also can be a negative self-expression, where you're not being assertive for yourself and you're not speaking up when you need to. The empathy skill, these 2 authors, Stein and Book, discussed it more as interpersonal. So this is how you interact with others. And it really is your empathy. And empathy is your ability to feel others or to relate to others' feelings and how they're feeling. And I think that that's a really important part and piece of a lot of emotional intelligence, is just knowing how others are feeling and understanding what's driving them. Inside that empathy and that interpersonal is also relationship building. And I think that that's an important one, especially in healthcare, that we work on relationship building. But also in this category is our social responsibility to make sure that each one of our interactions and dialogues are serving the greater good. So I think that's also an easy one for many healthcare providers, because most of us have that servant's heart. And so we're usually thinking bigger and not just about ourselves or our team, but really about how our actions and our response are going to affect our healthcare system or our patient population that we serve in our community. The 4th one is motivation or decision making. And this is where you use your emotions, both positive and hopefully you've reversed your negative, to solve problems and help you to make the best choice to solve that problem or to discuss that situation. There's a little bit of impulse control in this one, right? I need to tame my negative, or some authors call those the red feelings, and turn them into blue or cool feelings, so that I can do a little bit of reality testing so I can see the real situation. What's motivating this individual or this person to ask me this question? Is that motivation really in the question that they're asking, or is it in their perceptions or their past experiences that might have drawn this question up now, and really understanding what the real question is versus any underlying assumptions that I might have made or forgotten to make, based on what I knew about that patient, the person or that patient beforehand. And then that decision making or motivation is really using the right emotion to manage the situation. So I'm going to very simplistically try and describe that as crying while telling someone happy birthday, right? We wouldn't want to cry while we tell someone happy birthday. That's the wrong emotion for the communication of that message. The last one is social skills, and I think that one I would liken a little bit to your ability to manage stress and stressful situations as well. So being flexible, tolerating stressful situations, tolerating high risk or high critical situations, controlling your impulses and being able to control your message, and be thoughtful about the delivery of your message before you deliver it. And then finally, in that same social skills is your ability to be optimistic. So I think there's a difference between being happy all the time and being optimistic. And I think that really will play into why it's important for leaders, is that pessimistic leaders generally don't get many followers. People don't engage in their vision or their mission for their team if they aren't optimistic about what that mission or vision is. So the stress management or social skills, I think, is a really big, important part and piece of emotional intelligence. So if you had to ask me which one is most important for me, I would tell you that I have been in this position for almost 2 years. And I think that on each day, I look at it a little bit differently, and I'm looking at a different piece. It might depend on the situation that's going on for me, but I think that most often the component that motivates me, or that I feel like I need the most work on, or that's most important to me in my day-to-day, is really just the self-awareness. So looking at it and being thoughtful about how I'm going to respond, and then reflecting back after a response, or even bringing my team in and saying, I don't think that I handled that situation the way that I wanted to. Help me to learn, help me to grow. How would or could I have responded differently? And so I think that this self-awareness is a big one for me. But I also will say that empathy is a really important one, I think, for many healthcare providers. And that really goes to, again, that servant's heart, and the ability for us to advocate for our patients, for our colleagues, for our profession. So I think that the empathy side of that is also important to build relationships and trust.
Yeah, so it sounds like really the why. Why am I behaving a certain way, and why are others behaving a certain way? And the self kind of assessment and reflection is kind of really important questions to ask, and that can lead to growth and improvement of your social intelligence.
Absolutely, Chad. I think that you hit the nail on the head. So it's really just taking a moment to say, why do I feel upset or scared or rushed? And how is that affecting my delivery of the true message that I hope to provide to my team, to my provider, to my patient, to my spouse?
Sarah, this seems like a very complicated process that's kind of going on in the background in your thought process, within a couple seconds. So I guess two-part question that's kind of rolled into number 3 on our topics, but how has your journey with improving your personal emotional intelligence gone, and like kind of how do you plan to get better in these different areas when you know that you have seconds to kind of analyze the situation and really become aware of what other people are feeling and thinking and what you are thinking and feeling as well.
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought it up that way, Amanda, because that is that's great. I will tell you, I work on this every day. And I think that the way that you can, if you're facing that and you're saying, hey, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this perfectly, let me guarantee you that I don't do it perfectly. I frequently do it imperfectly. But I think that I'm going to break it down to something that we do, on a regular basis, just as learners, is that we go back to that basic direct instruction. So find a good book, find a good reference. Chad and I were talking the other day, and there's lots of great stuff out there on YouTube. So find something good that helps you feel a little bit more knowledgeable about emotional intelligence. But then I think that the other important part and piece for me, and I'm very lucky at the organization that I'm at, is that I'm able to watch others do this. So I am lucky to have a great crew of people who are very good at managing their emotional intelligence. And so I watch them in important meetings. I watch key physicians have interactions in rounds. I watch my own team interact with one another. So it's really that watching someone else, that modeling behavior. And then I think the other part is having a team of colleagues around you who are willing to coach you as well, to say, hey, Sarah, you maybe didn't handle that as well as you wanted to. Did you consider this or consider that? So it's back to that direct instruction, modeling, coaching, so that you can facilitate your own behavior and think about it a little bit more intelligently the next time that it happens. And I'll admit to you, Amanda, I don't do this perfect every time. I've messed up a few conversations and then looked back on it and said, oh, that wasn't what I meant to say, or that wasn't how I wanted it to come off. But I think that's using your own experiences. Find a leader, find a colleague, find a friend who does this well. But I think that the first step, really honestly, is listening to a webinar like this or finding a good book and helping yourself to learn a little bit more. Sometimes we don't know that we're doing it until our eyes are opened and we see, oh, that is why I respond that way, or that is why I might have done that coping mechanism.
Yeah, thank you. I like the thought of, modeling others and maybe even pulling in some of your closest mentors and friends to really be that seeing eye for you, and just having a conversation of how did you approach the situation and maybe how would you have done it differently. I think that would be very helpful for each of us individually to learn even what other people are thinking and how they interpreted something that you interpreted completely different.
Yeah, that's a very easy takeaway from today. So even if you found one person, I will say that one of the things that I did that was really helpful to me is I looked back at leaders that I really enjoyed working with, and I wrote down characteristics that those leaders had. And then I took it back to those 5 components of emotional intelligence. And many times those leaders that I thought were amazing had most, if not all, of those 5 components down pat. Then I did the opposite, and I wrote down characteristics of leaders that I wasn't as engaged in working with or didn't feel as comfortable sharing my ideas, and wrote down some of the characteristics that they displayed. And clearly, the emotional intelligence component was the thing that drew me to key leaders or made me want to work harder for key leaders. So I think that that's an easy one too. So that's a great idea to find someone to model, and maybe even just take some notes on what makes them great and why you picked them as your model.
Yeah, I like that. I think that leads really well into our 4th question, and why having a high level of emotional intelligence is so important for being an effective leader. And we had the conversation during our last webinar that, all of us in healthcare are leaders. So it's a really important topic and conversation that we can all be emotionally intelligent.
Agreed. I think that emotional intelligence, as I kind of alluded to, is more than just when you're being a leader, right? It's when you're being a parent, when you're being a sister, when you're being a brother, when you're being a wife or a husband. So I think that emotional intelligence doesn't just end when you leave work. It's something that you have throughout your life, and it helps you to communicate more effectively and for your message to be really understood, but also helps you to build those relationships, that trust, and really to address the concern that someone brought to you, because you have a much more robust understanding of what they're really asking you for. So I'm going to go back to the book that Stein and Book wrote, and I was really empowered by the fact that when I read that book, they said that intelligence IQ kind of peaks in our 20s and then, stabilizes and then wanes as we get older. But they found additional evidence that says that emotional intelligence really doesn't peak until we're in our 50s. So for someone who's not yet 50, I think that was really encouraging for me, because it helped me realize that I shouldn't have this mastered yet. That I do have a lot farther to go, and that there is a lot more for me to learn about my own emotional intelligence. So that really was inspiring. It actually helped validate a little bit that I was feeling not as great at being being good and being in control of my own emotional intelligence. It was helpful to know that, by the time I'm 50, maybe I'll have this down. And I think that, again, back to that same exercise of the individuals I really found to be really good at emotional intelligence, not all of them were in their 50s or older, but some of them were a little bit more mature than I was. And so I think that helped me to see that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's not a race to 50 per se, but it's a journey every single day to learn a little bit more about myself and why I respond the way I do, and how that helps me to build meaningful relationships. So I think that it's important just to identify that emotional intelligence does play into our interpersonal relationships and also into our communication venues. And as you mentioned, every single one of us is a leader. So every single interaction can go really great if we have a thought to why we're answering the way that we are. I'm sure you can both think of all sorts of reactions that you've had where you think to yourself later, that wasn't the most useful response. That wasn't the most useful reaction. And I could have handled that better. That's the first step, right? That's the first part of self-awareness, to say, I think I could do that differently. So if you're there, if you're thinking those things, you're part of the way to improving your own emotional intelligence.
Yeah, so I think some high-level takeaways just from the conversation so far today is, one, we should always be looking at improving our emotional intelligence, and two, the best way to do that is to practice that. And we can start that now. We can start at this instant, and it carries through really every hour of the day. So it's not something that we're just utilizing while we're at work, and it's really something that we can apply to every aspect of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Good summary.
Do you have any closing thoughts or comments?
I guess that I would just say, if you're curious, if you want to learn more, if you're thinking that you need a good reference, there's plenty of them out there. And I kind of, as I alluded to, this isn't something that you learn quickly and then you're done. This isn't reading a book and being an expert. As you mentioned, Amanda, it's going to take some time, and it's really about being aware and being open to the idea that you can do it differently. It's also okay with doing it wrong a few times or not handling it as well as you want. And that's how we grow, especially in emotional intelligence. Look at how we acted as children, as young children, until we got to where we are. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Yeah,
I like that. Thank you, Sarah. That was a really great discussion, and we will be having our live facilitated discussion on January 15th in the new year, and Sarah will be there for that. So if you guys have any questions, please do write them down and bring them to that discussion. And just as a reminder, CE will be available at the end of the entire series, and you do need to attend for the 4 out of the 6 webinar and facilitated discussions to get that. And we would like to just thank everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this and you're going to go out and practice your emotional intelligence.